Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome this distinguished panel to campus for a conversation on the surge of women running for public office in 2018. Our distinguished panel includes our moderator, Amy Walter, who is a new IOP Board of Advisors member this year, former Senator Kelly Ayotte, who is a visiting Pritzker Fellow at the IOP this week, Jennifer Lawless, Director of the Women in Politics at Institute at American University, and Lauren Underwood, who is running for Congress in the Illinois 14 District. I should note that as a tax-exempt 501c3 organization, the University of Chicago does not support or oppose any candidate for political office. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Wednesday, May 9th, Jeffrey Toobin of The New Yorker will be sitting down with UChicago law professor David Strauss to discuss the current Supreme Court term and what to look for as the court begins announcing its opinions. You can find out more about this and other upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. I'd like to remind students in the crowd that our IOP end-of-year survey is live right now. We would love to hear from you. Please fill it out by Friday. You can win a $50 Amazon gift card if you do. And you can find the link to the survey in your Thursday newsletter, either tomorrow or last week's, everybody. We will take questions at the end of the moderated conversation. We'll have a microphone in the center aisle. We will reserve the first 3 questions, please, for students. We remind you that questions do end with a question mark. Ask you to make sure that your phones are on silent. If you need the restrooms, they're on the first floor. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Maddie Anderson. Maddie is a 4th year from Chicago studying public policy and creative writing. During her time at the IOP, she has served as a Fellows Ambassador, a member of the Women in Public Service Program, and the Communications Multimedia Intern. Please join me in welcoming Maddie to the podium.
It is my great honor to introduce our Pink Wave panel today, comprising Kelly Ayotte, Jennifer Lawless, Lauren Underwood, and Amy Walter. Kelly Ayotte is an American lawyer and politician who has been called one of the 25 most influential women in the Republican Party. She served as a United States Senator from New Hampshire from 2011 to 2016. Prior to that, she was the first and only woman to serve as New Hampshire's Attorney General. Jennifer Lawless serves as the current director of the Women in Politics Institute, as well as a professor of government at American University. Before this, Ms. Lawless was employed at Brown University as an assistant professor of political science. The central focuses of Ms. Lawless's research are women in politics, campaigns, and elections. Lauren Underwood is an American political advisor who recently worked as the Senior Director of Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at Next Level Health. She also serves as an adjunct instructor for Georgetown University School of Nursing and Health Studies. Prior to that, Ms. Underwood was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as a senior advisor at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Ms. Underwood is running for Congress in Illinois' 14th Congressional District. Out of 7 candidates, she won the Democratic primary held in March by 57% of the vote. Finally, Amy Walter is an American political analyst currently serving as national editor of the Cook Political Report. Before this, she serves as the political director of ABC News, based in Washington, D.C. Today, these incredible women are joining us for a conversation about the future of women in politics and all things girl power. Since the 2016 election, women have mounted a movement that has been coined the Pink Wave. Women organized national women's marches in 2017 and 2018. 2017's march was the largest single-day protest in history. Women have held men accountable on a national level with the Me Too movement. Women have engineered consistent, progressive action on state, municipal, and local levels. Women have written, taught, researched, litigated, and made art as forms of movement building. And finally, a record-breaking number of women are running for office, up 60% from 2016. So, what factors are driving this pink wave? How did first-time candidates fare in the primaries, and how will they fare in the generals? What are the implications of this political wave, both in the congressional cycle and beyond? These power ladies are here to provide valuable insight into these questions. Thank you each from the bottom of my heart for being here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Maddie. Thanks for kicking us off. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a beautiful day. It's just, this is every day in Chicago at the end of the spring, right? Just 85 degrees and wonderful. Notice none of us are wearing pink, so I think that's worth bringing up. You can discuss women without having pink in the audience on the platform. But I do want to really dive right into a lot of the questions that Maddie brought up here, both about women as candidates, but also women as voters, and women's roles as we start thinking about the Me Too movement and others. How has that changed or not changed the way in which women are interacting in the workplace, and or is it changing the way we see women in those roles? But I cover politics, so I want to dive right into politics. Jennifer, you do this for a living. You've written books about this. The introduction ended with the note that we have more women now running for Congress than at any point, and yet it's not clear that that's going to translate into more women in Congress. So can you help us understand, when we talk about Year of the Woman and how many candidates are filed, how that actually translates into representation in Congress?
Sure. So the first thing to keep in mind are the basic numbers right now. Women are roughly 20% of the United States Congress. At the state legislative level, they're about 24%. At the municipal level, it's a little bit higher, roughly about 30%. So when we think about a Year of the Woman, the first ingredient that you need are more female candidates, obviously. And this year, we seem to have that. We've known since the 1980s that when women run for office, they're just as likely as men to win their elections on both sides of the aisle and in primaries and general elections. So having more women seems like a positive thing. But this time around, we also have a record number of male candidates. And what we seem to have are very, very crowded primaries on the Democratic side, largely inspired by the Trump administration. And this is a reaction to it. So this election cycle, women overall are about 21% of the congressional candidates. If you compare that to 2014 and 2010, women were about 20% of the congressional candidates. So simply having these numbers, even if women win at equal rates, is not going to be enough because only one person wins a primary and competes in the general. So it's terrific to have a record number of women, but that's only one step in a multi-stage process. And we shouldn't assume simply because we have this record number of women that we can say signed, sealed, delivered, mission accomplished, and we have parity.
Right. So talk to us then about it's not necessarily about candidates and more women in Congress. Talk to us a little bit about voters, though, and the intensity among women voters. We've been seeing sort of a record gender gap, at least in opinions of the president. And will this translate into, I'm looking for two things. One, just women as a percentage voting, how they vote for Democrats, a bigger percentage voting for Democrats in the midterm elections, and will they be a bigger percentage of the overall electorate? Like, are we going to see 54% of the electorate female? Something
yes
like that.
And yes,
Okay.
I think.
All right.
So a misconception about the gender gap a lot of the time is that people think it has to do with the sex of the candidate. It doesn't. It has to do with the difference between how male and female voters cast their ballots. And in every presidential election since 1980 and in every congressional set of elections since 1986, women have been more likely than men to support the Democratic candidate. So when you have a Year of the Woman, you can look at candidates in one place, but another place you can look are these voters. And if the special elections we've seen are any indication, if the Virginia off-year elections are any indication, we're going to see women turning out not only at higher rates, but by significantly higher rates. And we're going to see gender gaps instead of maybe 8 to 11 percentage points, upwards of 15, and in some of these races, possibly even 20 points. So it's going to be a year of the Democrat, there's no question. But because female voters tend to select Democratic candidates, right, at the voting level, at the mass level, it's certainly going to be a Year of the Woman as well.
Thank you. So of course now, because we just talked all about Democrats, we have to talk to you about being a Republican woman in this Year of the Democrat. Just as a point of transparency, Senator Ayotte and I are competitors. We've played on other teams. It has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with softball. Every year, for the last 10 years, the women members of the press corps in DC play women members of Congress for charity, raising money for young survivors of breast cancer. it's a pretty competitive
Oh yeah,
deal. I mean, there are cleats.
It's a competitive group of women.
Well,
like
right.
on both sides, right? The elected ones and the media. They are, yeah. We're
we didn't
in there to
get
win.
in those positions because we're not
we
competitive.
did not.
Yes.
Exactly.
So just imagine that.
But it's actually a ton of fun in the sense that it's very bipartisan, and we have a great cause. But it's actually great to see all the women playing together and just having a blast.
Yeah, it was. See, and so for me, again, this is not my partisan hat. This is my softball hat.
Yeah.
I'm not really happy about the wave of women running, especially young women running, because see, if you win, and you look pretty athletic, and there are also a lot of women who come from a military background. Like Navy SEALs and stuff, we're gonna get killed. Like that's our problem. So I need fewer younger women running for my own softball sake.
I have to tell you though, it's only fair to even it up because one of the disadvantages we had on the congressional women's team is that the press team was a bit younger than us. And so I think evening that up would be great to have some younger women on the congressional team.
Okay, now that we got through that, very important sidebar, let's talk about the fact that we are seeing record number of women who are Democrats running. I think the number right now, 247 Democratic women have filed to 83 Republican women who have filed. There are obviously fewer women sitting in Congress. The Democratic women in the House make up about 40% of the caucus. Women, 14%, something like that, of the Republican, a little lower. So what's going on with Republican women?
Yeah, so interesting enough, my numbers are a little bit different because I'm involved with an organization that is just newly formed this year called Winning for Women that is focused on helping Republican women get elected. And so they kind of track this stuff and they're looking at candidates across the country. And yes, there are fewer Republican women running for office, but on our front, our numbers are that there's actually an increase of women, even on the Republican end. It's not as great as the Democratic increase, no question, of women running for office. But there are Republican women running, and it's actually, from the 2016 election, we've seen, we think it's a 20% increase of, and there is a gap. If you look at the Senate right now, where I served, there's 23 women that are senators, by the way, a record in the history of the country, and only 51 women total have served in the Senate in the history of our entire country. It's a small group, too small a group. And yeah, for Republican women, it's in my party, that's why I'm part of this organization now that I'm not in the Senate, is really giving Republican women an opportunity, an avenue to run for office, encouraging them to run for office. And there certainly is a gap among the party, even in the representation of women in the electorate to the number of Republican women are running. So it's not as pessimistic this year as you would think. There are some great Republican women running, and I want to help increase that range so that we can have competitive women of different viewpoints that are running.
Is there a barrier, though, that's different for Republican women than for Democratic women? I've heard one of the hypotheses is, again, when you're in the party in power, there aren't as many challengers, but there are primaries, and that it's harder for Republican women to make it through a primary electorate. Is that a fair assessment or theory?
I don't know. I think that, listen, my first race, I had a really tough primary, and I beat 3 guys. And one of them was a significant self-funder who spent, I think, about $8 million against me. Ooh. So I think that the big step is getting women to run. Do I think Republican women can win a primary? We've seen it happen. We saw Deb Fischer win in Nebraska and beat a couple of really capable guys who had history in the state of winning elective office, like an attorney general. And so we can see, and we saw Joni Ernst do the same thing in Iowa. So actually Republican women can succeed in these primaries. Where I worry is that having them do it and actually get out there is even a bigger issue. One of the issues too is funding, right? So how many organizations exist that can help to support Republican women who are running for office versus there are a number of avenues that Democratic women actually have, like in Emily's list, that support specifically women running for office. And there are some on the Republican end, but they need to be more robust. And that's one of the reasons I've decided to kind of get behind an organization that's just in its infancy, but that really that's the goal of it.
Lauren, I want to get to you as our candidate now on stage. So let me see if I kind of got this.
Okay.
Can I say your age?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you're 31.
Yes.
You're working in Washington at HHS during the election of 2016.
Yes.
Donald Trump wins. You're like, I'm going to go now run for Congress. That's it. I'm gonna go back to Naperville and not doing that. So, tell me, like, you hadn't been involved in politics really before. You're obviously in a political world of DC and role, but would you have run had the outcome of the 2016 election been different?
I would have run probably for something else at a later date. I was working in the disaster response space. I worked in public health emergencies and disasters, and in particular during the election, we were still in Flint, Michigan working on the water crisis. And so when the election happened, the Trump team came in and made it pretty clear that they did not want to remain in Flint, and they did not want to continue forward the progress we had made on the Affordable Care Act to expand health care coverage. And so I knew I couldn't stay in government and help them sort of take away coverage from folks. So that's how I made the decision to return home. Illinois is a state that expanded Medicaid. That was my way of continuing forward that work on health reform by being involved in the Medicaid space. So when I got back, I attended our congressman's one and only public event of the year of 2017. It was a question and answer session hosted by the League of Women Voters in a community called St. Charles, which is outside of Chicago. And that evening, he made a promise that he was only going to support a version of Obamacare repeal, which would allow people with pre-existing conditions to keep their health care coverage. Now, as a nurse, I know how important it is for people who have chronic illnesses to have access to medications and procedures if they need it. Obviously, I worked on the Affordable Care Act in the early part of my career, so I've read the law and I believe in it, know that it works and that we can fix what's wrong. And I have a pre-existing condition myself. It's a heart condition that's well controlled, but it's one of these diagnoses that would be a risk factor in these repeal scenarios. When he made that promise, I believed him because it was personal to me. And then he went and voted for the American Health Care Act, which is a version of repeal that did the opposite. And so I was upset because I felt he didn't have the integrity to be honest with us the one time he planned to show up. And for me, that's not what a representative was supposed to do. So that's how I made the decision to run.
Okay.
And I think that, was the election outcome part of it? Sure, but that was, this is sort of the sequelae, if you're going to use medical terms, right? This is like a continuing factor after some other dominoes have fallen. But it's an honor to be able to do this. And then obviously, I ran against 6 men in the primary, which is quite a challenge as a first-time candidate.
Yeah.
But we figured it out.
How did that voice in your head, going to Senator Ayotte's point about, convincing women to actually do it? They can be successful, but they got to believe they can do it. So I want you both to kind of go to those voices in your head that were like, are you crazy? Why? You can't do this. Or, of course I'm going to do this.
It's probably yes.
It's probably to both. Of course you're crazy. But talk a little bit about how you worked through that and the responses you got from people when you told them. Okay. You could go for it.
I wanted to make an initial point about women running for office and getting more women to run for office that I've made repeatedly when I've kind of talked about this topic. And that is, compared to my male counterparts, women need to be asked. And I was one of those women. There were people that asked me to run. And it helped that there were credible people that said, I think you'd be good at this. And I think you'll be successful at it. And the reason I say that is because, no offense to my male colleagues, but they look in the mirror and they saw a U.S. Senator. I looked in the mirror and I didn't initially see a U.S. Senator, okay? Or a lot of the ones that I serve with, they see a president, right? I don't usually look in the mirror and say, there's a president, okay? So we see often women will say, I need to do this one more qualification I need, or I need to take this one more step before I'm ready to do this. And that's why people encouraging capable women to run is important. And it's even more important because, first of all, we're a minority in terms of representation of number of women. And so you don't have as many people to emulate and look up to and say, oh, yeah, well, it's obvious they've done it. And there are great ones, but not as many. And I think in general, my take is that we often need to be encouraged and asked. And so I would say that as a formula. For me, though, it was, number one, it's a huge decision to run for office. You have to have that passion. You have to have a reason you want to do it. And then you also, I had been an attorney general, but I was an appointed attorney general, so I'd never run for office before. My first run was for the US Senate. And I had never been to a Republican Party event. And so I had to get the nomination of my party because I had been an attorney general and I had to also enforce election laws, and I had stayed out of politics. I had a unique history. I was originally appointed by a Republican governor and reappointed by a Democratic governor. So I tried to play that job very straight because I thought that's how it should be played. And so I really had to introduce myself to a party. So I think that there were a lot of people who initially were very skeptical of me because of that. And just in terms of the decision to run, at the time I ran, my kids were 2 and 5 years old. So it was a big family decision of whether we would do this. And my husband has been incredible in everything that I have done, but it really is a team decision. So there's a lot of factors that go into place, but you won't do it. And I think it's important to encourage women to do it, to say you're qualified and you could do this. And that's what I think some organizations help do too.
When I was deciding whether to run, I had early conversations across the community. And I would say they ranged from neutral to intrigued, but nobody was like, yes, you should do it.
Great.
Yeah, that was not the reaction at all. Yeah. And so I had to really opt in, aggressively opt in. And I'll be honest, I had conversations with really dynamic women across the community, like, aren't you seeing what I'm seeing? Why don't you run? You would be fantastic. I will help you. And there was just so many, no, not a good time for my family. And so I just knew that, somebody had to do something, and I could do this.
Okay, fine.
Right, because, I feel like 2017 was a year of women in particular, but Americans really stepping forward and doing things they hadn't done before. A lot of people made their first phone call to their elected representative that had never once done that, had never sent an email, had never written a letter, had never marched. People were doing things as activists, as engaged citizens that they hadn't done. I'd never run before, and this is what I could do. And so women then in turn were my foundation for the campaign. Our largest source of financial contributions came from women, both in terms of the size of the contribution and the volume. Women were the largest source of volunteer support and really just gave our campaign all the energy that we needed. And so women have been like our rock in this, and I don't take it for granted.
How did you go about it with fundraising? You're saying women are a big component of it. How much of this fundraising came from those traditional, here's where you go to raise money sources? This is all this is like, what did you just logged onto your computer and got on Facebook and said?
So as a millennial, we use internet resources. So there's this crowdsourcing site called CrowdPack that lets you announce your thoughts or intentions of running, and then sort of see people make pledges. They're not charged until you file. And so, or charged meaning they don't make their contribution until you file. So I did that while I was deciding whether to run, because there were rumors going around the community. There's this woman, she has this healthcare issue, she's a doctor, she's a whatever. And they were getting the story wrong. So I needed to affirmatively state who I was, what my intentions were, and I did it through that site. So over the summer, we raised $27,000 in pledges from people across the district and the country who had heard about our story. So I think that helped just in terms of that grassroots energy that then converted into contributions once we filed. But honestly, I'm not a traditional candidate. I'm a 31-year-old black woman running in suburban Chicago and a half-rural district, right? So we've had to be creative in how we do our fundraising, and we're figuring it out. I'm not perfect. And yet, in the last quarter, we outraised my Republican opponent by over $100,000. And so, it's possible. Yeah. And for people, particularly women who are intimidated by the fundraising, please know that it's doable. And to be candid with you, that's not been my largest challenge in this race. The fundraising has not been.
What is the biggest challenge?
Staff. Finding people,
good staff?
Yes, finding good staff has been the hardest part, right? And that might be just this moment in time, but there's so many candidates running, right? So that's just operationally, but raising the money's there. We just have to go get it.
Right. and have somebody bring it to the bank for you.
Oh,
That's what you need.
Oh, sure. I don't. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah,
deposit.
you don't need to deposit. Jennifer, let's go maybe pull up 30,000 feet for a second and talk about, we say it's important to have more women in office. Let's get parity. But do we know? Is there any empirical evidence about why having more women is going to matter? I will say my first year in Washington, the first year I came to Washington was the infamous Year of the Woman in 1992, had very similar overtones, right? Sexual harassment, healthcare, and here we are 25 years later talking about sexual harassment and healthcare.
Right.
So can you help us understand and walk us through what this means and how it can matter?
So I don't know if anybody's heard, but party identification turns out to be a really big deal in American politics. So whether there's...
It's a hell of a drug, partisanship.
Right. So it turns out that whether there's a D or an R in front of your name is way more predictive of how you're going to legislate than the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in your DNA. And as a result, if you look at, and I've done this, and Sean Theriault, who's a professor at the University of Texas, he and I have a paper coming out in the Journal of Politics in the fall. None of the reasons that sort of the conventional wisdom would suggest we need more women bear out empirically. Okay. So it turns out that if you want to know how a legislator is going to vote on a final passage vote, whether it be about Obamacare or sexual harassment or trade deals or anything else, Democratic men and women almost always vote the same way, and Republican women and men almost always vote the same way. And we then expanded that, and we looked at procedural votes, right? There's all of this suggestion out there that women are more likely to come to Washington because they want to be problem solvers. Right. So we looked at these procedural votes to see, well, maybe women are more likely to cast bipartisan procedural votes, even if they're going to vote with their party on final passage. Maybe they want to move the process along. Maybe they don't want to stymie debate. No gender differences there. Then we looked at co-sponsorships. Maybe women are more likely to engage in bipartisan co-sponsorship. No gender differences there. Then we looked at congressional travel, right? Members of Congress go on these trips. They can be bipartisan or partisan. No gender differences there. It turns out that men and women within each party act pretty much the same way when it comes to legislative behavior. The one big finding was that women seem to put a greater value and a higher premium on what we call congressional school spirit or collegiality or civility. So women, as a proportion of their representation in Congress, are more likely than men to participate in the congressional softball game than men are the baseball game. Women have been systematically more likely since 2011 to participate in Al Franken's Secret Santa gift exchange than men. Women have been systematically more likely since 2004 to participate in Seersucker Thursday, right? So all of these activities where you can get to know your colleagues and develop these friendships are things that I think are important and that should be valued, right? Because that suggests that Congress could be a more civil, more collegial place. It doesn't mean that those relationships will translate into bipartisan cooperation on very partisan bills, but it does mean that maybe Congress would be even way more dysfunctional if we didn't have women there to try and keep things running in a civil way. Also, Senator Ayotte mentioned this. Role models are a big deal, and we don't have a lot of women in politics. And the evidence suggests that when there are women on the ballot, the electorate is more engaged and more knowledgeable about what's going on. And then finally, I would argue that when it comes to democratic legitimacy, we have a little bit of a problem as a nation when we're working with fledgling democracies to help them establish and rewrite constitutions and develop gender quotas, when we're encouraging them to hold themselves to a standard that we've never even been close to meeting. So, I think that these symbolic effects are not merely symbolic. They're really, really important in and of themselves, even in a partisan institution.
Right. Those are great points. And that's what I was going to ask, and all of you can weigh in on this, because it does seem like when women are the most successful, at least the idea of a year of a woman, or this is a great year to run as a woman candidate, it is about the sense civility's broken down, women can come in and be this nice salve, women clean up the messes. But is that really what you guys want to see as, okay, well, women are taking these sort of, it's almost traditional roles of being a female versus when there's a war, we want to get guys in. When there's some other big event, that's when you'll have more male candidates. Does that make sense? Do you sort of see where, do you worry about that this is when women succeed is when everything's collapsed and they say they would like you to come and clean it up versus we want more women there because we think they would be great to talk about defense or to talk about something that is not in a traditional female role?
I understand that. I don't think that's what's going on in my district,
okay,
at least. I think that we have a congressman who's been absent. And in that absence, people have been looking for someone to speak to issues that are impacting their families. And he is not doing that. And so regardless of gender, I think that the Democrats who ran in our primary were stepping forward and saying, I want to be your voice in Washington because we deserve better representation. And when I get to Washington, I want to get things done, right? And so the level of productivity coming out of the Congress, which Dr. Lawless didn't speak on, but is incredibly low. Yeah. And so, you know, I think that families are, in certain cases, suffering because Washington is not able to do their core function.
Right.
And we saw even with the very brief shutdown we had this year, right? When government grinds to a halt, that is a symptom of something being, you know, significantly wrong with our system. And so I think that this year is an opportunity for the American public to elect a Congress who's willing to do the work of that job, which is pass bills and deliver for the American people. And that's what my focus is.
Can I just weigh in for a minute? So that's what I'm worried about. And I'm worried that that kind of message, I think you're right. I worry that that kind of message winds up getting translated nationally in a way that could ultimately be a disservice to women. Because if we think that we expect women to come to Washington and clean up a mess and pass legislation and heighten productivity in a political institution whose rules and norms make it very, very difficult for people to do that, we might be holding women to a standard that our institutions actually could never allow them to meet. And so that's why I think part of the challenge for the media, but also for pundits and analysts and scholars talking about this election, is to identify what are realistic outcomes and what are normatively attractive outcomes, right? And so it's possible that women in a different institution could clean up the mess, but it's hard to imagine that just electing more women or even just electing more outsiders is going to fundamentally change the way Congress works, because a bill becomes a law the same way a bill becomes a law, right? And so I just worry a little bit about the expectation on the part of the American public that women will save the day when it's very, very difficult, given the way Congress works, to save the day.
Senator, can you talk us through this dysfunctional piece? You got to see it live and in person and close up.
Sure.
So is it as bad as it looks? Is it worse?
No, it's
Is it fixable?
It's bad. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think the issue that we have is that among the party divisions even, the divisions have gotten greater. So if I wanted to talk about a right to left spectrum, it's moved out farther this way on both sides. And the people that were more in the middle, they are quickly going away. And so bipartisanship is not something that is necessarily rewarded on the electoral context and from the people who are voting. Let me just say they want it, but it's really become a much more polar exercise from who's getting elected. Yeah. And then you have that gets reflected on how people react to each other in the Congress. And also, you know, we're in a place where things move so much more quickly. Like you've seen with the social media and the way that we get our news and we get our information, that that to some extent we're getting our information from people that agree with us. And the social media allows you to jump on something someone said very quickly. And that makes it, I think, to some extent, adds to, you know, division and quickly dividedness. I'm not saying that's the factor of why, but I think it's a setting that was different than if we look back when the Senate was more, or the House was more bipartisan. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, as the American people, you can't look at that and say, wow, this is how I want it to operate, right? I mean, when I was there, I didn't feel that way. I wouldn't say to my electorate, oh, this is perfect, this is how I want it to operate. I think the question is, are you going to be part of the solution, or are you going to be part of the problem as a representative? And, you know, I had a very bipartisan record in the Senate. I hoped that I would try to work across the aisle on issues to solve problems wherever I could. And that, to me, is more of that spirit is important. And I wouldn't diminish, even though I agree with you, I think women, if you come from a certain philosophy, you're going to have more of that voting record. But there is something that can't be diminished about collegiality that we need more of, because it is the more collaboration and collegiality, even if we have different political viewpoints, it does allow you to at least not think that if you disagree with me, that somehow that makes you a bad person. It's more of a disagreement on issues if I know you as a person. So I do think that the women in the Senate, for example, we got together for dinner, 4 times a year, and we had relationships and discussions that I think were helpful. So yes, there's much more in terms of functional we need to be, and we have to decide as individuals that that's important to us.
And you came into office in 2010, which was the so-called Tea Party year, right?
Yes, and I ran in a Republican primary in that year.
Right.
Against 3 guys.
Against 3 guys. And so does this feel, so you had all that energy
and there was a lot of energy
anger
around that
right.
in the Republican side.
That's right. So how did that, so then that you take that into Congress, right? And do you think that that also, that sort of combativeness, the anger about what was happening in Washington, Obamacare,
Sure.
other pieces of legislation drove that. And now we have an election where it seems like it's a reprise of that just
may
on the
be
Democratic
on
side.
the other side,
Correct.
right?
So does this feel familiar to you? Are we just going through another cycle like this?
As I heard sort of the description, I was actually thinking about that a little bit. And I think you have to respond to your constituents' feeling and understandable reason and energy of why they elected you and what brought you there. But also you can't interpret that energy and electorate as being the sole basis upon which you make decisions. So you need to respect it, but I think also figuring out that I may have been elected because of the energy on one side of the aisle on a particular issue, but to Jennifer's point of how legislation is done, it's still, in most instances, no matter which party is in charge, does take a collaborative effort. So I do see some analogies there, for sure, of what's happening in terms of number of candidates running and the energy out there.
I'm going to get to the audience in a couple minutes. I just want to ask one more question. So be thinking about what you would like to ask, and there is a microphone right here in the center aisle. So Lauren, I'm gonna end this portion with you and thinking about all of that energy. And there's a lot of it, as happens in a movement, that turns inward, right? Republicans turn against Republicans, sure. Democrats turn against Democrats. So in the Tea Party era, they knocked a lot of incumbents out that year, including many moderates. In the Democrats' case, there's a lot of talk about Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership writ large. Sure. That has been around a long time. I think the average age is 75 or 6 of the top leadership in the House. How do you view that? Do you think it's time that there's a leadership change? Is that going to be an important element for you should you come into Washington?
I'll say that I get this question a lot.
I'm sure you do.
And I usually try to bob and weave around it, just to be candid. I'll say this. Yesterday, she said that she was definitely running. Mm-hmm. And she said that part of her reason for running was that she didn't want it to be, quote, 5 white guys at the decision-making table. Mm-hmm. And that quote resonates with me. And I will just leave it at that.
Okay.
I think that is
why
a very...
can't it be you sitting at the... There are lots of women in Congress.
Yes.
Okay.
And
so
I
there
would
could be another
happily
woman
step
there.
up and serve.
Okay.
If my colleagues chose to elect me, if I win, when I win, and my colleagues choose to elect me and I get that, 218 votes to be Speaker?
That's it. Just 218.
Let's go.
In fact, you don't even need to be in Congress.
Let's go. I'm ready.
All right. Let's start with questions. If you could just, you want to just say who you are, or you can describe yourself very quickly?
Sure. My name's Joni Ernst. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm a 4th year in the college. My question has to do with entering the workforce, and as I said, I'm from Boston, which is kind of a city built on an old boys network, and I'm wondering what are some strategies in your career that you've used to overcome that boundary in a room full of men and how you've used it to your advantage.
Well, you know, I've had a couple of jobs where I've been in sort of a room full of men, because I was, before I was Attorney General, I was a fairly young lawyer where I was a murder prosecutor and in New Hampshire, and we would show up at the crime scenes in the middle of the night with the police, and the detectives were pretty much all male. And I think, how did I deal with those situations? And then I was the first woman to serve AG, and I was the chief law enforcement officer, so it was a lot of men. And in the Senate, there's a lot of men. So I think the way I've dealt with it is, number one, I've worked really hard and I've shown my competence. And that was from day one. I'm not going to tell you that people aren't going to, try to stereotype you because of what you look like, whatever you look like. And I think that when I showed my ability and confidence and stood my ground, that is when I earned people's respect. And I carried that forward. And what I found was interesting, at least among the law enforcement community, when I became Attorney General, they were my biggest advocates to keep me as Attorney General. So I was, as I told you, I served for a Republican and a Democrat, and one of the reasons the Democrat reappointed me was because of the support I had among the law enforcement community. And that was because of the job I did, and they came to appreciate that, I was good at what I did, and I listened to them. One of the things I think strengths that women bring, and men should too, is to be good listeners, because it's hard to represent people, it's hard to solve problems, it's hard to be a good leader without listening and understanding the people that you're working with and representing. So that's what I think. And let me just say one more thing. You need to ask for the job you want. It's really hard sometimes for us to think about, I think as a woman, to say, I need to ask for this job. And along the way in my career, I figured out that if I wanted to take that next step, even outside of elective office, I had to make my intentions clear, and I had to ask and tell people, this is where I would like this job, and here's why I'm the best person for it. And sometimes we don't do that as women, and we need to.
Does anyone else want to jump in?
I'll just say, I'm a nurse. I've spent my career in this female-dominated profession. And so the situation that you're describing has not been my professional experience, but running for Congress has been the first time I've really experienced both sexism and misogyny, and that is something that I didn't anticipate. And so I was ready for racism, to be perfectly candid with you, but this came at me out of left field. And what I would just urge you to do is learn how to recognize it, because you're better able to respond if you can call it for what it is. And I was not good at that in real time. I had started to, I just get uneasy, and I'd start to have like this feeling of just anger at some of the responses that I was receiving. But then once I put a name on it, then I started to have some tools to respond, right? And so anticipate it, and then build up your toolbox so that you can pivot away or neutralize that when it does come your way.
Yeah, and I would say I always worked harder than everybody else. And even today, I mean, I go to present at a conference and it's like I'm a graduate student practicing, even though I'm moving to UVA as an endowed professor in the fall, right? Like, I still act like I'm 24 and not in front of people, but in my hotel room practicing ahead of time, right? And so
I can totally relate to this.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And so it's like, and I know it, and I know it's ridiculous, but then when I go in and I give the presentation, nobody is not going to take me seriously. And so, maybe that's not fair, but my feeling is I pick my battles, and that one in life, I'm willing to still practice in the hotel room.
That's great. Thank you
so much.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Brandon. I'm a second year studying political science from Little Rock, Arkansas. I was wondering what advice you'll have for students or women of this age that are looking to get involved in public service, like maybe down the road.
So the millennial, sorry, should we make you go first?
So don't wait. Like, we need your voices now. And whatever you want to do, however you would like to express yourself and influence the direction of our country, I found that the community, the public, is like waiting and dying for your leadership on whatever issue you care about. And so I think that many of us think, oh, we're young, and so if only I had more experience. Oh, maybe at this next job, then I'll be able to be an authority on the issue. I think inherent in your experience, you can speak to the challenges of being a young woman, the challenges of perhaps looking for a job in this market, the challenges of whatever it is that you care about, and that inherent in your experience, you can lead on that issue, and we're counting on you to do so. And if you decide to run, I will 100% have your back, and want to see you get there and achieve your goals.
Wow.
I would just add also that you should look around and look at the people that are doing things you're interested in, and don't hesitate to go to them and talk to them about what they're doing and how they got where they are. And you'll find that for the most part, not everyone, but a lot of people are really interested in positions of talking to you because you showed an interest in what they do. And now that I'm doing this brief fellowship at the IOP, I've also been impressed with the level of internships that it seems like the students I'm interacting with are getting here on some of the government fronts. So I think you have some opportunities here at the University of Chicago with some of the networks on the internships that, depending on what your area of interest in is, if it's in the public sector.
And I'll just add to that, I was an IOP fellow in 2013 and had the same thing, wonderful, bright, engaged students, and then I would ask them what they were doing the next year, if they were graduating, and they were like on monster.com looking for jobs, and I was like, you guys, you want to work in politics, look around this the first floor, there's this guy named David Axelrod, you might want to talk to him. There are all kinds of people who sit on the board that you're meeting every day that these folks who work here are bringing into the IOP every day. So you meet them and you introduce yourself to them and you say, oh, I would like maybe to work at a place like that. Use that opportunity, because that's sort of the point of doing the work that you're doing, and that's a reason that the University of Chicago is bringing these people in, so that you have access to them.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
There's a lot of training programs. So I did one that Jennifer's Institute hosted at American University when I was probably 25, and I was working as a career federal employee, and I needed professional development, right? And I did these programs. There's programs for women specifically to learn how to get the leadership tools and confidence to run for office and to be engaged in politics, and they are excellent. And many of them are nonpartisan, so it's not necessarily teaching you how to be a good Democrat or a good Republican. They're teaching you how to be a great leader. And I would encourage you to pursue those opportunities.
One thing I would add, though, so Stephanie Shriak at Emily's List and I had a conversation recently about how one worry that we have is that women are going to get on this hamster wheel of trainings. Oh. And so what I would tell you, the piece of advice I would give you is, once you think that you're ready, you're ready. Go for it and ask for that job and apply for that position. And you can always get even more qualifications and more credentials along the way. But don't wait until you have 100% of what you think you need, because the other people out there aren't waiting.
No. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Alia Shazad. I'm a first year at the college studying to be decided. I'm also a co-chair of the Women in Public Service program for next year, and on behalf of myself and WPS peers, from the bottom of our hearts, we'd like to thank you for being here. So my question, Dr. Lovelace, you kind of touched on this earlier, but a lot of developing nations have seen women leaders of state. 41% of Nordic nations' parliaments are composed of women. So what exactly is it about the American political sphere that's holding us back from gender parity in both houses and holding us back from a female president? And part B, what can I, as a member of the upcoming generation, do to combat that?
That's a great question, because right now, as of today, 103 nations have a greater percentage of women in their national legislatures than we do. So one of the big reasons is gender quotas. About 75% of the nations that surpass us have some form of quota, either a voluntary quota that the parties adopt or a quota that is mandated by the parliament itself. That's not something that we're going to replicate in this nation. When you think about our individualistic political culture and our pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So that's one barrier. The second is a lot of the nations that surpass us, even when they don't have quotas, have very strong parties that identify the candidates and then in a party list put those candidates forward. In the United States, you have to be really entrepreneurial. We have a candidate emergence process where anybody can run for anything. Look around, you can see this. We have 525,000 elected positions in this country. Anybody can call themselves a Democrat, anybody can call themselves a Republican, and if you can build a campaign infrastructure, you can get on a ballot on either of those parties. And so if women are traditionally less likely to operate in the circles from which these entrepreneurial skills tend to be developed, it's going to take longer for us to reach that point. The good news is that when women are recruited to run for office, they're very, very receptive. And when they're receptive and they throw their hats into the ring, they're just as likely as men not only to raise the same amounts of money, but to win their races. So I don't think we should spend, I mean, it would be great if on the side we're focusing on systemic reforms and political institution building that could facilitate women's candidate emergence. But one thing that we know right now is identifying women in this room and in this community and in the state and in the country who would make for great candidates would go a really long way in allowing us to inch up on that ranking.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, my name is Sharon Lewis, and I am a community organizer and OFA fellow and potential automatic candidate. So my question is about the age gap. I find that many men run for office, they're older, and there doesn't seem to be any question as to how old or how young they are when they run. But when women run for office, it's always called into question how old or how young they are. So with the women who are in Congress, the age, is it problematic or is it more often called into question?
I mean, so the research indicates that women on average are a little bit younger than men on average, but that's because men stick around longer. So when women hit a career ceiling, they're more likely to retire. When men hit a career ceiling, they're like, all right, I'm going to stay around and accomplish nothing. It's fine. It's a nice job, right? At all levels of Congress, at all levels of the legislature. So overall, what that means is we wind up with, on average, younger women. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that women who are younger are held to a different standard than men who are younger, or that women who are older are held to a different standard there. I think what happens is unusual cases get picked up in the media. So the same way that, you know, oh, this is the youngest woman ever to run for such and such, or this is the oldest woman ever to run for such and such, is newsworthy and is garnering that kind of attention, in fact, because it's unusual, but that perpetuates a lot of misperceptions about what it's like to be a candidate running.
Okay, that answers my question.
So run whenever you want.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Thank you. I just want to make sure we get through. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Pamela Perry. And my question is, how do we prompt the people to get the legislators to work bipartisanly? Or are we the people too extreme?
There we go. That is the key.
I mean, that's the question. You've hit a very important question. It's, you know, do your representatives reflect how divided? Unfortunately, if you look at some of the polling on this, and the professor probably knows more about this than I do, but as a nation, we've become more divided. So whether it's geographic divisions, whether it's religious divisions, whether it's other types of issues that divide us, that has actually gotten bigger. And so in part, our electorate and the people we elect does reflect some of those divisions. And you know, whether we value, you know, whether we go to the ballot box with a litmus test, or do we go to the ballot box with trying to understand more the character of the person in terms of their ability to legislate and the skill sets, even though I don't have a checklist where I agree with you on every single issue. And I think right now our electorate is unfortunately more divided. You know, I obviously hope that we have more bringing people together. I think it would be better for our nation if we did that for both sides of the aisle. But that's my take on it, but I'm sure you probably know more about the research on this and where we are.
So redistricting is a big problem, especially for the House, because what that then does is also create districts that are more homogenous. So in primaries, you get extreme candidates. And even if the electorate isn't divided, right, there's some evidence that suggests that it is more divided, there's some that isn't, the choices they're given are way more divided. So let's say you have moderates that are leaning Republican and leaning Democratic. They're going to vote they're going to vote with their partisan hats, and they're going to elect people that are way, way more extreme than they are, and then that's going to become a cycle. And so it's bad. It's both from the mass level up and the elite level down.
Yeah.
And they reinforce each other.
And I think the other challenge, and Jennifer brought this up with what's happening in other countries, right, where you have a really strong party structure that sort of vets people out and sort of decides, okay, we're going to put these people up front. Well, we have our parties now are probably weaker than they've ever been, which you can look at it two ways. One, okay, this is great. It means that the people are going to be more involved in the process, right? You can't, the idea of the smoke-filled rooms and the old white guys who pick who they want to be in office, those folks are gone. But what they also did was to help ensure that some of the more maybe not helpful people, destructive personalities, people who say, I want to come to Washington just to like blow it all up, I'm not there to get anything done, that they would have been weeded out, right? And so you have, we're at this time where everything's being disrupted. We don't really know how to put it back together. I don't think it's ever going to look like it once did. We can't go back to smoke-filled rooms. But it is somewhat ironic that we have the parties that are as weak as ever, and we're more partisan than ever. And so trying to figure out how to put those two things back together is going to lead to better outcomes. Yeah.
I think one factor also in the weakness of the parties, is how parties are funded now. So parties, when one of the issues in terms of some of the campaign finance reform that was done, actually did weaken parties in terms of how they raise money, and then you have an outside factor now that wasn't there before that can raise a lot more money than the actual party itself. So there's some underlying mechanisms too that I think have contributed to the parties not having as much power as they used to. And to Amy's point, nobody wants, listen, if it were a smoke-filled room, I would have never gotten that nomination, I can tell you right now.
Right.
I
don't think anybody on this dais would have gotten
I don't want that, but there is some value to the party having an ability to help once a candidate has gotten through the nomination process, organize, and especially if you're a new candidate and you've not run for office before.
Hi, thank you. My name's Sarah Miata. I am a nurse practitioner, resident of Oak Park, and some would say an unprofessional political pundit. My question is to Senator Ayotte, in that the pink wave and the mobilization of women in response to the general election in 2016 seems to be a referendum on the Trump administration and Republican policies. And the Trump administration seems to have aligned himself with the more extreme members of the Republican Party. So I was hoping that you could comment on what it's like to be a Republican and a woman, and how you encourage women to run for office on the Republican platform in this environment.
Oh, sure. Well, the interesting thing is that, at least from the group that I'm involved in, there does appear to actually be more Republican women running this year, not in the numbers that Democratic women are running, but there is a percentage increase overall. And so you still have a number of Republican women who are throwing their hat in the ring now. In terms of being a Republican, I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge, that it is sometimes hard being a Republican woman, is that we don't have monolithic viewpoints, whether we're a woman or whatever our background is. You can't just look at someone and say, well, that's a woman, so she must think the following things. I mean, part of our freedom should be that no matter what our background is, we have the freedom to think and believe things, that we're not going to be stereotyped of what those beliefs are. I think that we do have some strong women. I'd like to see more Republican women in the House and the Senate running. And they're going to make their own viewpoints of what they agree with the president on and what they don't agree with him on.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Hadia Afzal. I'm actually a DePaul student, but I'm also a candidate for office for DuPage County Board out in the suburbs. And so my question, since I am a young candidate and you've spoken to the women in this area or in this room, telling people to run at a young age, I'm wondering, as older women in politics, do you still experience imposter syndrome? And if so, how do you deal with it? I know it's hard to get once you decide to throw your hat in the ring and start running. That's a big step on its own, but are you still plagued by certain insecurities, and how do you deal with those?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm in the hotel room practicing.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah, I have lots of, sure, we all have insecurities. It's really, I mean, one of the hard things about running for office, and so I admire anyone who puts their hat in the ring, is, and being in the arena, is your life is out there, it's all to bear. Everything you've ever said, anything you've ever done, people that know you, your family, whatever it is, it's out there. And sure, we all have insecurities about that. And it's a performance. I mean, meaning, like, every time you're in a group of people, like, you're there to convince them to vote for you and to sign on to your ideas. And that takes we all feel insecure about the things as humans we feel insecure about. So I don't care what position you're in, that we're always, all of us, kind of looking in the mirror and say, yeah, I can do this. So I feel that having been a U.S. Senator, having been an Attorney General, I still have to overcome some of those insecurities, even for what I've accomplished thus far in my life.
Same. And I would just add that I don't think people are necessarily looking for perfection. I think folks are looking for an authentic voice and someone who really cares. And that I can master. Being my full self and being genuine. And I think from what I know about you, you do too, and I'm looking forward to your victory.
Thank you.
I have to say that's such a great point. Authenticity is really important and undervalued.
Great, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Michelle, a second-year student in the college. We recently had Jennifer Palmieri on campus, and she talked about the unrealistic expectation that women are sometimes expected to fill with regards to being emotional and open and kind and genuine and authentic, but also to be able to put her foot down, to be powerful, to be capable of making hard decisions. I want to hear about what your experiences have been in fluidly navigating that unrealistic, perhaps, expectation of being able to fill so many different shoes.
It's tough. And I'm not always perfect at it. I'll tell you this. I will roll my eyes from time to time, and it's very inappropriate, and I get all kind of feedback about it, right? But is that the authentic expression of my feelings? Sure. And people know. And I think that others probably feel the same way. You're just not supposed to show it. And we're supposed to be congressional, and eye rolling's not.
Oh, sometimes it can be, actually.
Okay, good.
I think one of the things that I certainly can speak to is it's not fair, but women are often judged on things that my male counterparts would have never been questioned on. Like, I mean, do you ever hear a discussion over what kind of tie our male candidates are wearing? But we often judge a woman about how she looks or what she's wearing, or and those, so there are some double standards out there that exist for every woman who runs for office, no matter what your party is. And there is somewhat this view of the superwoman, right? Who can sort of, do it all perfectly, and that, so, I mean, my kids were 2 and 5 when I ran, and so I got a lot of questions in my first primary about, and by the way, I had both my children while I was Attorney General, so the public in New Hampshire were used, when I first got appointed Attorney General, I was 6 months pregnant. They were used to sort of seeing me with motherhood and those questions being raised while I was Attorney General, and seeing me do it. And when I ran, I got a lot of questions that my male counterparts never did, and questions like, what's going to happen to your children? And my husband, when he'd be there,
they're fine.
Yeah,
They're 2 and 5.
Right.
Like, they
like
can
I'm
be
not
at home by
going to leave them.
themselves.
Right. I mean, we're like suddenly we were going to leave them, on the street or something. And my male counterparts didn't deal with some of those questions. So there is a challenge when you are running, that you still are overcoming some issues that men aren't really asked about. And I just answered the question, and I just said, this is what we're going to do as a family. And my husband would be the most offended by it. He's like, who am I, chop liver over here? I support what she does, and I'm going to help parent these kids too.
I mean, the really good news is that although these things still happen, the evidence suggests that they're not determinative for voters. So it's unfortunate so I ran for Congress in 2006 in the Democratic primary. I lost, probably because I eye-rolled too much and people told me my voice was too high. But, I mean, I remember right the day before the election, I was campaigning outside of a grocery store, and this woman came running up to me so excited. She thought she was being so nice, and she was yelling, "Don't worry, don't worry." And I thought, oh, she's going to say, "Don't worry, you're going to win the election." And she said, "Don't worry, you don't look nearly as fat in real life as you do on TV." So I said, "Thank you." I should have said, "Oh my gosh, neither do you." But anyway, but in telling the story, the reason I'm mentioning this is because people are not always raised that well, and they say awful things to other human beings, right?
Sure,
and they say things that you think like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that those words just came out of your mouth." And that's something that as female candidates, or as women in positions of power or in leadership, we have to figure out how to deal with, and how much we want to sort of brush off, or the extent to which we cannot let it affect us.
I like humor.
But the good news is that even for most of the people saying those kinds of things, it's not actually how they're then going to behave when they're faced with decisions. And that demonstrates, I think, pretty substantial evolution. And that's a good thing, and it's a positive thing. So it's unfortunate because a group of us still have to deal with it. But the good news is that it's not keeping us from achieving.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Nina. Excuse me. I'm a law attorney for the Chief Judge of Cook County. I've graduated from Roosevelt back in 2009. Due to circumstances, I took customer service jobs, and I began my career as an extern back in 2007. After my last child went to college, I was a single mother of 4. And so it's somewhat difficult for me to transition from one atmosphere to the other, and being from the south side of Chicago. I was just wondering, do you all have any type of advice for me?
Who wants to jump in about being a candidate now?
I know it's not a political question, but you four are powerful women, and you all have seen and been through a lot of transition.
Well, you have experiences, and you have also probably people that you've interacted with. Whether you want to run for office, or whether there's something in public policy and service. Your experiences and your background are really important voice. And one thing I found when I ran for office, because I'd never run before, is like raising money is a hard thing. So I'm glad it's been easy for you, but I thought it was really hard.
Not easy, but not hard.
Okay. I thought it was really hard. And so one of the things I kind of think about when you put together, you decide you want to run, or you're going from one transition of a career to another and want to do something different, is the people you've interacted with in your life are a network that you don't even realize. And so, like, I raised my first $100,000 in my Senate campaign because my husband and I sat down and made a list of 100 people we thought would give us $1,000, just because, not because they necessarily had the same philosophy on everything, but they believed in me as a person. And so that's just some advice. It's not easy to break out and decide I'm going to do something different, but there are also people out there and networks that you should look at of people who can help you, and even in your own circle that you probably haven't even thought about.
And I can just tell from your life that you're a pretty courageous person. And doing this requires an unbelievable amount of courage, and so that means that you pass the first hurdle, because so many people are too scared to try. and too scared to tell their truth. And you've told us a lot about yourself. And so I think that you're going to be really successful. And so just be fearless and jump in.
Yes, and grow my wings on the way down.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Thank you. And it seems, ironically, that the tables have turned, that I am the only man to jump onto this queue. Nevertheless, my name is Jason Schatz. I am a master's student in computer science, but before that, I majored in government and writing at Wesleyan. But in my mind, it seems that one of the main obstacles to having young people, and particularly young women, running for office is the expectations. It seems that the zeitgeist is shifting its expectations of what it means to be a strong and successful candidate. And it emphasizes strong candidacy over whatever values we believe should make a strong and respected statesman. The values that are conducive to campaigning are not necessarily the same ones which are conducive to statecraft. So how do we improve the notion of what a statesman could be? Is it hewing to a certain ideology when the parties are polarizing between themselves and amongst themselves? Is it commitment in a certain sphere? Is it a decision-making process which could transfer over into statecraft? How do we make sure that people who consider running for office can see a pathway such that they could be an effective statesman?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
So I'll just say, as a candidate, it's become increasingly clear to me that there is only one metric that matters outside of having an election and the percentage that you win by, right? It's how much money can you raise, and particularly the funds raised in comparison to the others in your field, right? So Amy works for probably like the premier political rating organization, right? And that is probably a very high criteria that you use when determining amongst candidates, right? But that's getting to viability, which is different than being a statesman. And those are just fundamentally sometimes very different things. And at the end of the day, what this side is about is winning an election. And winning an election and having the competencies to do a job are also not the same thing. And so we have to rely on the voter to be able to distinguish between those two, because our system, I don't believe, is set up to do that for us. And so I think that if we're going to improve the system, we need to, fix the role of money in politics. We need to have fair and equal maps, and we have to have voting rights. And all three have to happen. And that doesn't even get you to statesman, but that helps fix our system, at least in terms of electoral politics. That's just my opinion.
And what I would add to that, so we did a national survey of high school and college students, 4,200 of them, and 89% of young people have already decided that under no circumstances would they ever run for office. In large part because they look at the dysfunction, they look at the qualities of some of the men behaving badly in Washington, and this is men and women alike. And they look at what it takes to be a successful candidate, and they figure that if they want to get involved in public service and if they want to make the world a better place, there are many, many ways other than electoral politics to do that. And so I think one of the biggest challenges and what we really have to do is convince young people that there are certain things that only elected officials can do, whether it be at the local, state, or federal level. And unless they get in and unless they have that unless they run for office themselves, they're not going to be in a position to change the system in such a way that it's more encouraging for more people to get involved. So I know that that's a little bit of a circuitous kind of answer, but if the best and the brightest of the next generation are already writing off a political career because of what they think they have to do, we're going to continue to have just a bunch of stunted student body presidents run for office in uncontested elections.
Not that there's any.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
With student body presidents.
On that note.
Yeah.
Somehow experience.
Yes. Okay, we have time for one more question. Why don't you come on up and give us your question?
All right, I'm Voidy of the Revolution Club, and I came into here not really expecting to see eye to eye on the whole way of how the world changes. I'm a revolutionary, so that's a huge thing right there. But there is something that's kind of like eating at me and like kind of getting into this, because there is a huge wave of so many people actually coming into political life right now, you know, in response to the situation that we're facing, you know, where there are people who are extremely trying to do so much to this planet and this earth. You know, when you think about, you know, what Trump and this whole rise of not just people in the White House, but also people in the streets carrying out, you know, very violent acts against people, you know. And I really want to pose this question to, like, the panelists and also everyone in this room of, like, are these really the terms in which we talk about, you know, or think about human life? You know, like, I was kind of surprised a little bit at, like, you know, there wasn't much talk about, like, the real, what's happening to people, except for, like, the woman who's running now. As in terms of, like, what's happening to millions of people. You know, you think about Flint, you think about, you know, this crisis of, like, what the planet is going through, as well as, like, you know, what's happening to immigrants right now. And there's a real human toll that's taking place. And I want to hear from you guys and, like, talk to me afterwards. I'm encouraging people to get into a talk by Bob Avakian, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go, but yeah.
Okay. And I just want to jump in, and I do think I'm going to piggyback off of something that Jennifer said about convincing people that this is why it's important to do public service, even as it seems like nothing can happen in a city that's so dysfunctional, but government at every level still matters. And if you're not getting involved, then somebody else will. If these two didn't run, somebody else would, and they're making decisions every single day. So your choice is, you know, you can take yourself out of it, or you can engage in it, but it's going to keep rolling along. And I do think we're getting a real crash course in 27. What are we in? We're in 2018. It's all how government works, right? You had a president who ran on a personality, right? I can do this. I can go and make Washington work, coming up against the realities of this is actually, you know, we have different branches of government. You can't just do one thing. Congress can't just do its own thing. The courts can't just do their own thing. So I think we're kind of letting people, this is a sort of civics lesson for everybody in watching that. And that, at the same time, you can connect what's happening on the ground, the most important things that matter to you, to what's happening in Washington, whatever that is. And I think that Lauren expressed that really well about her frustration about healthcare and what she was seeing in her own backyard brought her to do this. I don't want to speak for you, but it sure seems like that was.
And this is an activist in our community. There's been some fatigue. You know, the resistance is hard, and it gets to be taxing sometimes, right? And people ask us, you know, how can we keep going? And I tell folks in my community, pick an issue. Just pick one, if that's all you can manage, and stay on top of that one issue and be the best advocate you can be on that one issue and engage, right? And if at the end of that engagement you decide to run to do something about it, even better. But I think that I have been overwhelmed at times by the number of things that are sometimes feel that they're going awry in our country. The Washington Post had an article about 3,100 lies that the Trump administration has told in the last however many months. And 3,100 is a big number, right? Like, no one can take on 3,100, right? But you might be able to take on one and be committed to that one. And healthcare is what got me into this race, and I'm committed to that work. Along with others, I care, but healthcare is what really was my motivation. Yours might be the environment or something else, but I think that you can be really impactful digging deep on that one issue. And then to your point about service, government service, I was a career employee in the federal level for about 5 years. And that is a thankless, unglamorous job, but we need our career federal workforce to be strong and robust. And right now, I believe that there's a lot of opportunities for you and your colleagues to have tremendous impact by joining and serving the American people in that way. And so whatever issue you care about, you can have a tremendous impact by working in government. And so don't discount it.
And also it takes, it's process, and it takes a long time, and it's actually supposed to take a long time. It's good that sometimes we don't, out of immediate passion, do something. Now, whether that's at City Council has a different process, but we're talking here about the federal, at the federal level. All right, well, thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for coming out tonight. Please thank my wonderful panel. And of course, thank you to the IOP and University of Chicago. Have a great night.